My name is Patrick Stokes. I'm in the philosophy department at Deakin University here in Melbourne, Australia. Delighted to be taking part in this panel today, and in this video preliminary to the panel, what I'd like to do is do what philosophers typically do, which is to barge into a fairly practical, serious discussion and throw in a few questions which look like they're vaguely helpful, but which turn out to simply complicate and derail everything. I wish I was exaggerating, but that's largely what we're going to end up doing. Specifically, I want to raise some questions about whether a lot of the existing processes or conceptualizations of the digital assets that people leave behind when they die and the ways in which we've been thinking about their preservation and reuse or reanimation, whether the ways in which we've been coming at those ignore some really important philosophical questions around the nature of personhood, the nature of agency, and whether these in turn have important implications for how we dispose of or preserve or reuse these digital remains, to anticipate a little bit. So questions around the preservation and reuse of digital assets of the dead have understandably tended to come at these through two lenses, one being existing assumptions and legal assumptions about property rights, and existing or speculative assumptions about the privacy rights, if any, of the dead. Of course, in a lot of legal systems, including here in Australia, the dead simply don't have privacy rights. But we can see that a number of the ways in which contests around access to and reuse of digital assets of the dead have tended to be seen through those two frameworks, and have often, where there have been controversies, they've been because those two aspects have been in tension with each other. So, do I have ownership of these assets, and if so, am I allowed to do other things with them, or does the dead person have a right to privacy, which would trump my ownership or property rights over those assets? The problem with this approach, I think, is that it brackets some really important, possibly even unavoidable questions, namely whether, in fact, digital assets are best thought of as forms of property, or whether at least some classes of digital assets of the dead, not all, but at least some of them, are something else if they have some different kind of status. And so related to that, the question of whether reuses in particular, such as reanimation of digital remains, like the Robert Kardashian hologram recently, count as person-involving or even potentially as forms of survival in ways that will have downstream implications for those privacy discussions. Now, in philosophy, of course, we've been talking for a very long time, and when I say a very long time, I mean I think this starts with Aristotle, about the nature of posthumous harm, whether it is possible to harm a dead person, how such a thing can happen, how there can be a harm on the assumption that the subject of that harm, the harmed person, does not exist or does not exist as a person at the time of the harm event. There's a number of related questions around this. Questions also related to biological survival through corpses and so forth. I'm not going to get too deeply into some of that stuff. I'm happy to bring it up in discussion. But the question that I want to sort of raise here that comes out of this philosophical activity on death is, how do we have a posthumous subject of potential harm who might then, for instance, be subject to the sorts of harms that might generate, for instance, privacy rights? Now, one way I think we can come at this is through the notion of digital remains, which is, of course, a way in which digital assets have been, or some digital assets have been, conceptualized in the literature in recent years, which is used, if you like, as a kind of a structuring metaphor for digital assets. What I want to suggest, and what I've certainly suggested in my recent book, Digital Souls, is that we shouldn't be thinking of digital remains purely as a metaphor, as if it's just a metaphor. If we take seriously the idea that certain kinds of online artifacts, certain kinds of data are constitutive of persons, as Floridi would say, but constitutive in a way that is actually strongly analogous to or relatively similar to the way that bodies constitute persons, then it becomes clear that traditional property-based approaches to digital assets just won't work. You don't inherit a corpse. What you have instead is a set of rights of disposal and a duty to dispose or preserve that corpse in a certain kind of way that is attentive to the moral value of the person who has died. Accordingly, then, as Brubaker and colleagues found as far back as 2014, it's appropriate that we think in terms not so much of ownership of at least certain classes of digital assets as stewardship of those assets. And that then will have implications for who can reuse digital remains, which uses will be morally permissible and impermissible, and what sort of responsibility we have to the dead whose remains we are managing. I don't know if you saw just recently, William Shatner from Star Trek has just turned 90, and being the shy, humble fellow that he is, he has celebrated by setting up, through the company Storyfile, an interactive online version of himself that future generations will be able to ask questions of. I'm quite taken by the line there where the CEO of Storyfile says, generations in the future will be able to have a conversation with him, not an avatar, not a deep fake, but with the real William Shatner answering their questions about his life and work. Now, that, to a philosopher, is red rag to a bull, really. What do you mean it's the real him? What makes him the real person? But what this does activate, I think, are a number of really important questions around personhood and survival that we do need to start getting clear on. And digital reanimation, I think, throws those questions into very stark relief. Is an avatar the person themselves, or merely a representation of that person? If it is capable of interaction through AI, are we justified in taking it to almost replace the person who has died, or partially replace the person who has died? Does it inherit some of that person's status, or some of that person's moral liabilities? Does it speak for or on behalf of the dead person? If it changes over time through a process of machine learning, does that invalidate personhood claims? Does it invalidate them any more than the fact that each of us changes over time invalidates claims to ongoing diachronic personal identity? And so stewardship models of the dead will also have to address these ontological questions that are raised by digital animation. So I guess those are just some of the sort of background conceptual questions that I wanted to throw into the mix. As I say, I don't think they're going to make the conversation any simpler, but I do think they are really important philosophical questions, ontological questions with downstream ethical questions that need to inform the way in which we think about these assets. There's my references, and oh dear, I've accidentally dropped a plug for my new book, Digital Souls, A Philosophy of Online Death, in which I try and lay out some of this in a hopefully accessible way. Thank you very much, and I very much look forward to our panel discussion.